if our hearts are not sincere, then we won't have the response of God. To worship God in spirit is what really matters.
Door of my heart.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Badri, and with my wife Gita, we're delighted to be here with you all, and hailing from, well, we're your neighbors down south at Ananda, Portland, and it's just a great joy to be with you. We think we get a little more sunshine than you down there, but in terms of a wonderful spiritual community and temple, we're about the same. Okay, so I'd like to start or continue with the reading from Whispers from Eternity, a beautiful book of Yogananda's poems and prayers, number 139. I want to hear thy song in the silence of my soul. Thy gentle voice saying, "Come home," I often heard, but through many lives it was drowned in the tumult of my wild cravings. I have forsaken the jostling crowds of desire. In the solitude of my mind, my devotion bursts to hear thy voice. Take away every dream memory of earthly sounds that yet lurks in my mind. I want to hear thy still voice, ever singing in the silence of my soul. So today's topic, how should we worship, or what's the best way to worship? I'll get to in just a moment, but first I wanted to acknowledge that I know we're kind of the warm-up act for some very special guests next weekend that are coming here, Nai Swami Jyotish and Nai Swami Devi. And we also had the very good fortune and blessing of having Jyotish and Devi visit us at Ananda, Portland about a month ago. And in addition to being the Dharmacharya and spiritual director of Ananda Worldwide, Nai Swami Jyotish enjoys to tell a good joke, and he told me this one. Sometimes less good jokes, but this one was pretty good, and it's about a little boy caught cheating on his test. And if Jyotish starts telling it, I'm sorry I stole his thunder, but he probably has another one for you. So the little boy is called up to the desk by his teacher, and he says, "Little Johnny, I think you were cheating on your test." And he kind of affects innocence and says, "Well, how do you know that?" And the teacher says, "Well, look at your history test here, and your neighbor there, little Annie in the desk next to you, and look at her test. The first question, who was the first U.S. president? She wrote George Washington, and you wrote George Washington." And he said, "But everyone knows that." And the teacher said, "Well, look at the second question. Who was the president that helped free the slaves?" "Well, Abe Lincoln, Abe Lincoln." And he said, I read that in the history book. Everyone knows that." And the third question, look at this one. It says, "Who was the president during the Louisiana Purchase?" And little Annie wrote, "I don't know," and you wrote, "Me neither." So, like with all good jokes, there's sometimes, usually, maybe a little lesson in there, if we can extrapolate. And besides the fact that I think maybe you can never really cheat on any test of life, I think there's also the takeaway that perhaps in any test, be it in our schooling, in a challenge in our lives, or as Kriyananda called the final exam at the time of our death, parting from this world, that we only have our own self to rely on. And that's sort of the topic and really at the heart of today's reading, that we only have the self, and that there are as many ways to worship as there are individuals. If we look at the 8 billion people on this planet, there is no one that prays and meditates and loves in the same way as me or you. And so, although many of them seem to have no interest or even perhaps be inclined to pray or to worship God, nonetheless, their hearts beat with the same cosmic life as you and me. They bleed like we bleed, and they cry tears of sorrow and smile with joy throughout all of life's experiences. And this is the common thread that runs through all life and all nature and all people everywhere, is that we all have our own unique way about us, and yet there is this commonality. There is this mutual thread. I watched a beautiful movie recently called Moscati, which I think maybe some of you recently watched here too. A beautiful spiritual movie about an Italian saint and physician who lived about 100 years ago in Naples, Italy. And he dedicated his life to God and served the poor. And he was a brilliant physician. And as a young man, he befriended an older doctor, a physician, who was also a professor in the college, in the university there. And I think his name was Arcangelo, but in the movie. But at any rate, there's a wonderful scene where they're together. Arcangelo is kind of this quintessential atheist scientist, who believes in knowledge and truth and is very dedicated to helping others. So he has a beautiful, good heart. But here, his friend, the young man Moscati, also has this passion and this beautiful, good heart. But he loves God and he sees Christ and God in others and is just completely dedicated to serving selflessly. And so they're in the lab or studying together, and Moscati is there looking in the microscope at some cells or something, and he says, Arcangelo, the more I study all the anatomy and the sciences, he says, I see the beautiful, joyful, creative intelligence of the universe manifest everywhere. And his friend is sort of playfully griping or scoffing and with all this talk of spiritual philosophy. And he says, oh, look, you've made me late again. What will my wife say? He says, she has creative intelligence too. And when I get home, she's not as merciful as your God. But later in the movie, in another scene, Moscati comes to his aid at the time of his death. He's eating dinner at home, Moscati, and he has this sudden intuition that his friend is dying, and he rushes to his aid to be there. And he says, how did you know? Because he just has a sudden stroke or heart attack. And he says, you know how I knew, because God told him. And there's just a beautiful scene at his parting where, again, by sharing the light of God and the goodness of his own heart, Moscati changes the lives of others and of this friend of his. But there's this element of our own lives that in whatever way we seek God, if we do it with all our hearts, it doesn't really matter so much how we do it. I mean, of course it matters. I have a friend at Ananda Village who many of you know, he's a great friend to all, or some of you will know, Nai Swami Sudarshan. And he's been a meditator and seeking God for a long time. And every year in the spring, he takes about a month-long seclusion. And I love to talk to him after his seclusion because he's always praying to God, to Divine Mother and nature spirits, and has all these interesting experiences. And one time after his seclusion, he told this story that he was meditating long hours, and then he was preparing this health drink. For those of you that know, Yogananda's vitality drink for this diet he was doing, and he was grating some carrots. And after his meditation, he was trying to just think of God and feel God's presence in everything. And so he was grating the carrots, and he had the carrot kind of horizontal, and then he started grating it the other way, vertically, and he was talking to God, and he said, Divine Mother, do you like it when I grate the carrots this way, or do you like it when I grate them sideways like this way? And he was really praying, again, playfully but earnestly, and sharing this, and like this for a while, but sincerely. And he said he finally kind of heard, a voice or his intuition answering, Sudarshan, I don't really care how you grate the carrots, but thank you for asking, because God knows what's in our hearts, but it's up to us if we want to share it in a silly, trivial way or in ways that are really hard and really matter. And it's true most of the time, it doesn't really matter what we do. I mean, of course it does. But as long as we have positive intent and we're trying, and if we have a relationship with God, if we're giving our hearts to God, then the battle is won. It'll be messy sometimes, or confusing or challenging, but that's what really matters. Now, there's another element to today's reading that talks about worshiping God in spirit and in truth. And it actually references pilgrimage and going to holy places. And to worship God in spirit means to worship God in the silence of the soul, as we've been doing, and been talking a little bit about. And to worship God in truth means to go to sacred places, to gather before the altar, or to places that are sanctified by holy saints or sages. And in fact, we'll be leading a pilgrimage, Naiswami Hriman and I, to Southern California, of all places, in October this year for 4 days to visit these shrines of Yogananda that are very holy and sanctified by Yogananda's presence. And in fact, we'll have a little satsang, just informal, after service today for anyone interested about that. But you can go to these places where Yogananda said, I meditated all over these grounds and impregnated this place with the holy vibrations of God. And you can feel it very powerfully when you go to India or Medjugorje or, again, Southern California, of all places. But as Yogananda said of Mount Washington, one of these holy sites in California, he said there are many rats and mice living in the canyons here at Mount Washington, but they're not making spiritual progress. And so it's not only by proximity or, location that we can achieve or receive these holy blessings. We can meditate and pray at the most sacred site on the most auspicious day, with the most holy prayers. But if our hearts are not sincere, then we won't have the response of God. And similarly, a poor beggar in the streets, with nothing and no one, who gives their hearts fully to God, can receive that divine blessing despite. And that's why to worship God in spirit is what really matters. I had an interesting experience on another pilgrimage to India on my birthday last year, about 7 months ago, October 27th. I had the good fortune to go to Babaji's cave in India, among other sacred places. And in Babaji's cave, where Mahavatar Babaji met Lahiri Mahashai and had this incredible experience outlined in Autobiography of a Yogi, you can go and meditate there. And I went there at a particular time, about midday, when there was a large group that happened to be leaving. And so I was really fortunate to have Babaji's cave all to myself. So I went into the back of the cave, and I set up a little altar and kind of all my meditation stuff, and I really resolved to go deep on my birthday and just this special blessing. And it really was a powerful meditation and a really special experience. But after about an hour and a half, another group of people arrived, including some friends of mine that were on this pilgrimage with me, and some unknown people, including one person. There's about 10 of us in the little cave there, about the size of this diet, a little smaller than this. And this one individual who was doing all kinds of weird, like Kundalini yoga things, violent breathing and contorting himself upside down and rapid movements, and really disturbing, for those of us that were trying to meditate, everyone else in stillness and in silence. And some people left or kind of moved around, and even though I looked over at him a couple times, I really was resolved to just keep my concentration. I was having a really deep, still meditation, and I wasn't, this was a rare opportunity, and I wasn't about to give into this weird thing. So I just stayed with it for a long time, and until he continued on for quite a long time himself, but until it was just the two of us left in that cave. And finally, I felt that I was in a castle of peace. I was praying to our masters. This was Babaji's cave after all, and this guy was possessed or something. And he kind of mellowed out towards the end, and then the docent came in because they locked the cave at night, and he said, it's time to go, and he kicked us out of there. And as only can happen in India, there was some Baba outside in his orange robes, and I namaste to him, and then there was this fellow, this weird Kundalini guy, and he looked at me, and I looked at him, and I just kind of nodded, and then walked down the trail, and just sort of floating in God. And it was a weird experience, but again, I felt that I was worshiping God in spirit above all, but also in the truth of this holy, amazing place. And again, the conviction of my own meditation and my heart wasn't about to be disturbed by this other weird reality. With respect to meditation and worshiping God, again, we each have our own unique path there is the path of Kriya Yoga, which Yogananda has given us and these masters have given us, which is the highest way for devotees of this path to study and to worship God. But there are going to be rhythms in our own life that really determine, the way that we can best worship God. In my own life, I can think back to when I first came to Ananda Village in California, and even a couple years prior, and I had a very devoted daily meditation practice. And I still do, I always have. But there was a period of life when that really shifted for me. And when I first came to Ananda Village, I would meditate every day for 2 or sometimes 3 hours. I would have a longer meditation every week of 3 hours or more. And I had a lot of really deep experiences at that time and wonderful meditations. Then I met my wonderful wife, and we had some kids. And for parents, I was thinking in the calendar, like the Julian or the Gregorian calendar, there's the BC period before Christ, and then there's AD, Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. And for parents, there's BC before children, and then AD after diapers, and or always distracted. And so I found that after children, after diapers, my meditation really changed. It got shorter, it got a bit more distracted, and frankly, it's never been the same. I mean, quite honestly, and my kids are 8 and 10 years old now. But it's changed and deepened and lengthened where it can over the years. And this is the real takeaway, for me, despite the fact that my sadhana and meditation really changed, objectively maybe for the worse in some ways, my spiritual life has never been richer, since embracing that part of my dharma, my family, loving and serving and seeing God in my family and my children, and never giving up on meditation. It's not like I let it go. I've kept at it with all my heart, just knowing that it's a different phase of life. And so the best way for any of us to worship is really between us and God, to find out how we can best do that with all our hearts and with deep devotion, and as I said, with Kriya Yoga. With Kriya, Paramahansa Yogananda said that the pathway to God, the highway to God, is in the spine, and that the temple of God is in our own body, and that the way to worship God is in spirit, within. And the most powerful places of pilgrimage we can go are within. And the ultimate religious rite is this self-offering of the energy of the life force within us to God, with all our heart, with all our mind, as it says in the Bible, with all our soul, and with all our strength. And this is the highest path, the highest way to worship God. And in Sanskrit, there's this beautiful term, Ishta Deva, that is kind of a concept of a personal relationship with God. And for those of us devotees of this path, we worship Yogananda not as God, but as an awakened master in God, as a representative of God. And we worship God as Divine Mother, as Yogananda encouraged us to do. But that there's this relationship that's personal. We can worship God as joy. We can worship God as love. We can appreciate God in the form of Lord Krishna, or different saints and masters throughout time and history, because each one has a special message of love to convey in a different way, in a different time, and it's for us to develop that relationship. Swami Kriyananda would even joke sometimes, God will come to you as a sacred crocodile if you worship him enough or her enough that way. So God will take the form most dear to us in our hearts if we really love God and worship God and meditate in that way. There's a beautiful story from the life of Lord Krishna, the incarnation of Vishnu and Lord of the universe, when he's talking and asking his foremost devotee, Radha, and he says, Radha, why don't you practice the highest technique of yoga? And she simply says, how can I, Lord, when all I can think of is you? And this is an instruction and an inspiration that the highest form of worship to God is communion with God. And like Radha, the goddess of love, and worshiping Krishna that she had reached the end and no longer required the means. And so when we sit to meditate and we practice the techniques of Kriya Yoga and we love God in the form that is most dear to us, at some point we have to let go of the seeking and the searching and the technique and just be in God. And like Yogananda's beautiful poem, God, 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 we'll find that the Spirit of God is just blissfully humming always silently in our souls. God, God, God. Thank you.
Your flute has called me to the fields. Now I've no place to live.